June 4, 1942. 5:28 in the morning. Latitude 30° north, longitude 179° west. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky caught between night and dawn, that peculiar hour when stars still clung to darkness while the eastern horizon bled purple and gold. The water moved in slow, heavy swells, each crest catching the first light like hammered steel. Somewhere in this vast emptiness, two fleets hunted each other with the patience of apex predators, each commander knowing that the next few hours would reshape the war. Perhaps the world itself. Lieutenant James Murray felt the vibration of twin Pratt & Whitney engines through his boots, through his seat, through his chest. The B-26 Marauder, a machine the men called the Widowmaker for its unforgiving flight characteristics, shuddered as it climbed through 800 feet. Behind him, in the bombardier's compartment, his crew member adjusted the torpedo release mechanism for the third time. Ahead, nothing but ocean. No landmarks, no reference points, just the compass heading and the certainty that somewhere out there, Japanese carriers were launching the strike that would either crush American forces at Midway or meet their own destruction. Murray's hands were steady on the controls, but his mind raced with calculations that had nothing to do with altitude or airspeed. They had launched from Midway Atoll before dawn, 4 B-26s armed with torpedoes, sent to find an enemy fleet that intelligence promised was coming. Find it, attack it, somehow survive it. The mathematics of survival seemed particularly cruel this morning. A lumbering medium bomber designed for land-based operations, now skimming wave tops with a torpedo slung beneath its belly, hunting the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled in the Pacific. The radio crackled. Static, then a voice. Contact. Bears 320, distance 150 miles. The Japanese mobile force had been found. To understand what happened in the sky above the Japanese carriers that morning requires stepping back 6 months. To a world still reeling from the shock of December 7th, 1941. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, they didn't just sink battleships and kill sailors. They shattered an assumption. America, protected by two vast oceans, had believed itself invulnerable to sudden attack. That illusion evaporated in 2 hours of methodical destruction. But Pearl Harbor created something else. Something the Japanese High Command had not fully anticipated. It transformed American industrial capacity from peacetime production into an engine of total war. By June 1942, American factories were already outproducing their Axis counterparts in aircraft, ships, and weapons. The gap would only widen. Yet this industrial advantage meant nothing without the ability to project power across the Pacific. And in the spring of 1942, America's ability to do so hung by the slenderest of threads. The Battle of Midway represented Japan's attempt to extend their defensive perimeter and draw out the remaining American carriers for decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood that Japan's only path to victory lay in crushing American naval power before that industrial might could be brought to bear. His plan was elegant and complex. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, followed by an overwhelming assault on Midway Atoll itself. The American carriers, rushing to defend this strategic outpost, would sail into a trap. 4 Japanese carriers supported by battleships, cruisers, and the largest concentration of naval air power ever assembled. What Yamamoto couldn't know was that American code breakers had pierced Japanese naval communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the attack was coming. He knew the date, he knew the target, and he positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway in a counter-ambush that would decide the Pacific War. But carriers alone couldn't defend Midway. The atoll's garrison included an odd collection of aircraft: obsolete Buffalo fighters, dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo bombers, and 4 B-26 Marauders hastily modified to carry torpedoes, despite having never been designed for such missions. These land-based aircraft would form Midway's first line of defense, launching against the Japanese fleet before the carrier battle began. The men who flew these missions understood the arithmetic of their assignment. Japanese carriers bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Their combat air patrol consisted of the world's finest carrier fighters, flown by combat veterans who had swept through Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with barely a loss. American torpedo attack doctrine required slow, straight approaches at low altitude, making the attacking aircraft perfect targets for both fighters and flak. At the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier, American torpedo bombers had been slaughtered without scoring a single hit. Yet orders were orders. Find the fleet, attack the fleet, damage the carriers before they could launch against Midway. Lieutenant Maury and his crew climbed into their B-26, knowing these odds. They carried no illusions about glory, no assumptions about survival. They carried a torpedo, a compass heading, and the grim determination of men who understood their role in a larger design. At 5:52 a.m., the 4 B-26s spotted smoke on the horizon. As they closed, the smoke resolved into shapes: carriers, battleships, cruisers arranged in the precise geometric patterns of Japanese naval doctrine. The mobile force, steaming toward Midway at 25 knots, preparing to launch its second wave. This was the moment of decision. 4 medium bombers against the most powerful naval fleet in the world. Maury pushed the control yoke forward, dropping his B-26 toward the wave tops. Torpedo attacks required low altitude, both to ensure the weapon entered the water cleanly and to stay beneath the arc of the heavier anti-aircraft guns. At 200 feet, then 150, the Marauders screamed toward the fleet. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Every ship in the formation seemed to open fire simultaneously. The sky filled with black puffs of heavy flak. Lighter automatic weapons traced glowing lines of shells across the morning sky. The combat air patrol, dozens of Zeros diving from their patrol stations, converged on the attacking bombers with the precision of wolves cutting a straggler from the herd. Maury's aircraft shuddered as shells tore through the wings and fuselage. The radio operator called out damage reports in a voice tight with controlled panic. Hydraulic failure, control damage, oil pressure dropping. But Maury held course, boring in toward the nearest carrier. Akagi, flagship of the mobile force, the very ship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The carrier grew larger in his windscreen with terrifying speed. He could see aircraft spotted on the deck, could see crew members running across the flight deck, could see the muzzle flashes of anti-aircraft positions firing directly at him. The torpedo release point was approaching. A few more seconds. Hold steady. Ignore the shells ripping through the aircraft. Ignore the Zeros on his tail. Hold steady. And then something extraordinary happened. As Maury's B-26, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, roared over Akagi's flight deck at less than 100 feet altitude, he released his torpedo. The weapon splashed into the water, ran hot and true toward the carrier's hull, and missed, passing just astern of the massive ship. But in that moment of closest approach, with his aircraft thundering directly over the carrier's deck at full throttle, Maury found himself looking down at faces. Japanese sailors, frozen in their gun positions. Flight deck crew, diving for cover. Officers on the bridge, staring up at the crippled bomber with expressions of shock. And many of them didn't fire. Not because they couldn't. Not because their weapons had jammed or their ammunition was depleted. They didn't fire because in that fraction of a second, survival instinct overrode training. The B-26 was so low, moving so fast, that firing upward risked hitting their own ship, their own aircraft, their own crew members on the opposite side of the deck. Some guns fell silent. Some tracked the bomber but held fire. Others shot wildly, shells arcing into empty sky. Maury hauled back on the control yoke, coaxing his dying aircraft up and away from the fleet. Behind him, the other 3 B-26s pressed home their attacks with similar desperation and similar results. One aircraft, too badly damaged to maintain altitude, made the extraordinary decision to strafe the length of a carrier's deck. A last defiant gesture from a crew who knew they had only seconds left. Another lined up on a battleship, released its torpedo, then climbed through a wall of flak that seemed impossible to survive. All 4 aircraft had been hit. All 4 pilots fought damaged controls and dying engines. And somehow, incredibly, 2 of them made it back to Midway. Maury's B-26 touched down with hydraulic failure, shot up engines, and holes you could put your fist through. His crew climbed out, touched solid ground, and tried to process the fact of their survival. The attack had scored no hits. The torpedoes, whether due to faulty depth settings, evasive maneuvers by the carriers, or simple bad luck, had missed every target. By conventional military metrics, the mission was a failure. Yet something profound had occurred in that moment over Akagi's deck. Something that would echo through the rest of the battle and the rest of the war. The Japanese sailors who looked up at Maury's aircraft that morning had expected many things from this battle, but not this. Their training, their experience, their entire naval tradition emphasized the decisive battle, the clean exchange of gunfire between disciplined formations. Even in the age of carriers, Japanese doctrine conceived of naval combat as an extension of the great gunnery duels of the past. Carriers launched strikes, softened the enemy, but battleships delivered the knockout blow. What they had not expected was the sheer recklessness of American tactics. Here was a land-based medium bomber designed for horizontal bombing from altitude, skimming wave tops with a torpedo slung beneath its belly, boring in through walls of flak with an intensity that bordered on madness. The Japanese had faced brave opponents before: Chinese pilots in outdated aircraft, British defenders of Singapore. But this was different. This was an opponent who seemed willing to trade any odds, absorb any losses, press any attack no matter how suicidal the mathematics. In the after-action reports and private journals kept by Japanese officers who survived the battle, this theme recurs. Surprise at American tactical recklessness combined with grudging respect for the courage it required. A Zero pilot who had chased Maury's B-26 described the crippled bomber's escape as impossible by any rational calculation. The aircraft should have exploded or crashed, yet it continued flying through pure will. But beneath the respect lay something more troubling for the Japanese command structure. The realization that they faced an enemy who would not be defeated by conventional military calculus. The B-26 attack, futile as it seemed in terms of damage inflicted, had disrupted the launch of the second wave against Midway. It had forced carriers to maneuver, fighters to engage, defenses to activate. It had bought minutes. Precious minutes that would prove decisive when American carrier aircraft arrived shortly after. More fundamentally, it had demonstrated that American forces would attack under any circumstances, with any available weapons, regardless of losses. This was industrial warfare distilled to its essence. Throw enough attacks, absorb enough losses, and eventually sheer volume would overwhelm even the most skilled defender. The Japanese had prepared for a battle of skill and precision. They were getting a demonstration of industrial will. On board Akagi, the morning continued its terrible progression. Murray's torpedo attack ended at approximately 6:20 a.m. By 7:00 a.m., another wave of attacks from Midway had begun. Marine dive bombers and obsolete torpedo planes pressing home assaults with the same desperate courage and similar lack of success. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol shot them down in droves. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Yet each attack forced the carriers to maneuver, forced delays in aircraft operations, forced the fleet to maintain maximum alert. Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, commanding the mobile force from Akagi's bridge, faced an increasingly complex tactical problem. His first strike against Midway had departed at 4:30 a.m. Now, approaching 7:30, those aircraft were returning, many damaged, all needing to land and rearm. Meanwhile, American attacks kept coming. And lurking in the back of Nagumo's mind was the possibility, increasingly likely given the intensity of land-based resistance, that American carriers might be nearby. His aircraft needed rearming. The first wave had launched with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs. But after seeing Midway's defenses, they needed to be rearmed with land attack weapons for a second strike. Nagumo made the decision to rearm. Crews began the complex task of bringing aircraft up from the hangars, removing torpedoes, installing general-purpose bombs. Then, at 7:28 a.m., a scout plane radioed the message that would doom the mobile force. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 0-10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. American ships. But were there carriers among them? Nagumo hesitated. Reverse the rearming process? Wait for confirmation? Launch immediately against potential carriers? Or finish the second strike against Midway first? For 15 critical minutes, he waited for confirmation while his crews continued rearming aircraft in the hangars below. At 7:45 a.m., the scout plane sent another message. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief. No carriers. Continue the rearm for Midway. The work proceeded. Then, at 8:20 a.m., the enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The moment of decision had arrived, but the decision had already been made 15 minutes earlier. Aircraft sat on the hangar decks surrounded by torpedoes, bombs, fuel lines, and ammunition, a lethal fire hazard waiting for a spark. Nagumo ordered an immediate reversal. Rearm all aircraft with anti-ship weapons and prepare to launch against the American carrier. At 10:20 a.m., American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. They found the Japanese carriers in the worst possible condition. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed, hangars filled with weapons and fuel lines. Combat Air Patrol drawn down to wave-top level after defending against repeated torpedo attacks. In 6 minutes of devastatingly precise dive bombing, American aircraft destroyed 3 of the 4 carriers. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became flaming wrecks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, would launch a retaliatory strike that damaged Yorktown before being destroyed herself that afternoon. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or sunk. The mobile force, the spear point of Japanese naval power, had been annihilated. American industrial capacity, given time by the sacrifice of men like Murray and his crews, had delivered a blow from which Japan would never recover. The torpedo that Murray dropped that morning now rests somewhere on the Pacific floor, its warhead unfired, its mission seemingly unfulfilled. Yet to dismiss that weapon as wasted is to misunderstand the nature of the battle. Midway was not won by a single torpedo or a single bomb. It was won by the accumulated weight of attacks, by the disruption of Japanese operations, by the minutes bought through sacrifice. Every B-26 that attacked the mobile force that morning created ripples. They forced carriers to maneuver, breaking formation and disrupting operations. They kept the combat air patrol engaged at low altitude. They delayed launch schedules and rearming operations. They demonstrated to Japanese commanders that American forces would press attacks regardless of losses, forcing defensive measures that consumed time and resources. The 6 torpedoes carried by those 4 B-26s cost American taxpayers approximately $12,000 in 1942 dollars. The 4 aircraft cost roughly $180,000. By contrast, a single Japanese carrier represented an investment of millions of dollars and years of construction. Yet in the strange arithmetic of industrial warfare, the exchange ratio was irrelevant. America could build replacement aircraft faster than Japan could train replacement pilots. American factories could produce torpedoes by the thousands, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace lost carriers. Muri's flight over Akagi's deck, that moment when Japanese gunners held their fire rather than risk hitting their own ship, symbolized a larger truth about the Pacific War. Japanese forces, trained in precision and efficiency, found themselves fighting an enemy who could afford to be wasteful. American tactical doctrine in 1942 was often crude and costly, but it was backed by industrial capacity that turned losses into mere statistics rather than strategic disasters. The object that recurs in accounts of the battle is not sophisticated. It's the simple torpedo, that blunt instrument of naval warfare. American torpedoes in 1942 were notoriously unreliable. They ran too deep. Their magnetic detonators failed. Their contact exploders malfunctioned. Yet America kept building them, kept launching them, kept sending aircraft and submarines to deliver them until sheer volume overwhelmed Japanese defenses. When Japanese engineers examined American torpedoes recovered from attacks, they noted the relatively crude construction compared to their own sophisticated long-lance weapons. What they failed to understand was that crude but abundant would defeat sophisticated but scarce every single time in industrial warfare. Lieutenant Muri returned to Midway Atoll at 7:14 a.m. on June 4, 1942. His aircraft was so badly damaged that it never flew again. It was stripped for parts, cannibalized to keep other aircraft flying, and eventually pushed into a coral pit and buried. Muri himself survived the war, flew additional missions, and rarely spoke of those 6 minutes over the Japanese fleet. In his rare interviews about the battle, conducted decades later, he focused not on heroism, but on mechanics. The control problems, the hydraulic failure, the calculations of airspeed and altitude required to keep a dying aircraft in the sky. When pressed about the moment over Akagi's deck, when asked what he thought as he looked down at the Japanese sailors, he gave the only answer that made sense. I thought about getting out of there alive. This is the fundamental honesty that separates historical truth from propaganda. The men who fought at Midway were not superhuman. They were mechanics and farm boys and college students who found themselves in aircraft, fighting a battle that would determine the course of the war. Doing so with faulty equipment and desperate tactics and a survival instinct that somehow coexisted with absolute commitment to the mission. The Japanese sailors on Akagi who looked up at Muri's aircraft that morning were equally human. They were not comic book villains or mindless fanatics. They were professional sailors serving aboard the fleet that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. They had families, training, pride in their service. And in that split second when a crippled American bomber roared 50 feet above their heads, many of them made the entirely rational decision not to shoot, if doing so risked hitting their own ship. This too reveals a truth about industrial warfare. It reduces human courage and human fear to tactical variables in a larger equation. Japanese sailors on Akagi were brave. They had proven that at Pearl Harbor in the Indian Ocean. In every engagement of the war's first 6 months, American pilots attacking that morning were equally brave. But bravery became irrelevant when matched against industrial capacity and tactical surprise. The sun set on June 4, 1942, over an ocean littered with debris. 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or sunk. Thousands of sailors and airmen had died on both sides. The Japanese advance across the Pacific had been stopped decisively and permanently. Never again would Japanese carriers operate with the freedom they had enjoyed in the war's first 6 months. Never again would Japanese commanders believe they could win a decisive battle that would force American surrender. In the wreckage of the mobile force, survivors clung to debris and waited for rescue. Some would be picked up by Japanese destroyers. Others would die of exposure or shark attacks over the following days. Among the lost were irreplaceable veterans, mechanics who could service carrier aircraft in their sleep, pilots with hundreds of carrier landings, commanders who understood the intricate ballet of carrier operations. Japan could build new carriers, though even this would prove beyond their industrial capacity by 1944. But they could not replace the human expertise lost at Midway. The American torpedo bombers and B-26s that attacked that morning had seemed obsolete. Their tactics suicidal, their weapons ineffective. Yet they had accomplished something that precision bombing could not. They had bought time. Time for code breakers to read Japanese messages. Time for American carriers to position themselves. Time for dive bombers to catch the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. This was democracy at work, though not in the idealistic sense taught in classrooms. This was democracy as industrial capacity, as the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting, as the willingness to send men in inadequate aircraft on desperate missions, because adequate aircraft didn't exist yet, but would in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years when American factories reached full production. The torpedo that Mori dropped symbolizes this perfectly. It missed its target. By conventional standards, it was wasted. Yet its impact rippled through time, disrupting operations, forcing decisions, buying seconds that accumulated into minutes that accumulated into the margin of victory. In total war, there are no wasted efforts, only investments in eventual triumph. 70 years after the battle, historians still debate the tactical details. Could Nagumo have won if he had made different decisions about rearming? Should the scout plane have found the American carriers earlier? Were American torpedo attacks merely suicidal gestures or essential components of victory? These questions miss the larger point. Midway was decided before the first aircraft launched, decided by industrial capacity and strategic position, by code breaking, and by Japan's fundamental inability to sustain a war of attrition against American productivity. The tactical details, including Mori's desperate flight over Akagi's deck, were the mechanisms through which this strategic reality expressed itself. Japanese commanders had expected to fight a war of precision and skill, of quality defeating quantity, of their superior training and equipment overcoming American numerical advantages. What they encountered instead was an enemy who would attack with whatever was available, would absorb catastrophic losses, and would return with better equipment and more numerous forces each time. When Mori's B-26 roared over Akagi at full throttle, trailing smoke and defying every rational calculation of survival, it carried a message more powerful than any torpedo. America would not quit. Not after Pearl Harbor. Not after the fall of the Philippines. Not after defeats in the Java Sea and the Coral Sea. They would keep coming, with whatever aircraft they had, until industrial capacity and strategic depth overwhelmed Japanese skill and determination. The Japanese sailors who held their fire in that moment recognized this truth, even if they couldn't articulate it. They saw a dying aircraft that should have crashed but kept flying. They saw a crew that should have retreated but pressed the attack. They saw the first glimpse of what total war against American industrial capacity would mean. On Midway Atoll, as the sun set on June 4th, ground crews counted aircraft. Of the 4 B-26s that had launched that morning, 2 had returned. The losses were catastrophic. 50% casualties for a mission that had scored no hits, damaged no enemy ships, seemingly accomplished nothing measurable. Yet in the coral pits where damaged aircraft were pushed and buried, in the maintenance logs where mechanics recorded structural damage and battle damage and the impossible repairs that had kept dying aircraft flying just long enough to reach home, in the quiet conversations between survivors who couldn't quite believe they had survived. In all these places, another story was being written. It was the story of men who had faced the most powerful naval fleet ever assembled with obsolete tactics and inadequate weapons, who had attacked anyway, who had flown through walls of flak and fighter attacks and come home to report what they had seen. They had seen the enemy. They had survived the enemy. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that the enemy could be beaten. This knowledge would spread through American forces in the Pacific like wildfire. The Japanese carriers were not invincible. Japanese fighter pilots could be outfought, outproduced, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The mathematical advantages of industrial capacity could be converted into tactical victories, given enough time and enough willingness to pay the price. Maury's torpedo, lying somewhere on the Pacific floor, has never been recovered. It rests in darkness, in pressure that would crush a human body in seconds, in a place where no light penetrates and time moves differently. Perhaps it's fitting. That torpedo, and the thousands like it that missed their targets or malfunctioned or were launched from aircraft that never made it home, represents the hidden cost of industrial warfare. We remember the victories, the successful attacks, the precision bombing runs that hit their targets. We forget the majority of weapons that missed, the majority of attacks that failed, the majority of missions that accomplished nothing measurable. But in total war, even failures accumulate into success. Every attack, successful or not, forces the enemy to respond. Every mission forces defensive measures, consumes resources, inflicts psychological strain. The torpedo that misses still forces the carrier to maneuver. The aircraft that is shot down still absorbed ammunition and fighter time that might have been used elsewhere. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years after Midway. American forces would island hop across the Pacific, each landing contested, each advance paid for in blood. Japanese defenders would fight with courage and determination that approached the superhuman. Yet the outcome was never in doubt after Midway. American industrial capacity, given time to reach full production, would eventually overwhelm any enemy resistance. By 1944, American factories were producing aircraft at rates that would have seemed impossible in 1941. Essex-class carriers were sliding down shipways every few weeks. Entire fleets of Liberty ships were being launched in days. The B-26 Marauder, that difficult aircraft that men called the Widowmaker, was being produced at hundreds per month and used for tactical bombing across Europe and the Pacific. Japanese factories, meanwhile, struggled with raw material shortages, bombing raids, and the simple reality that their industrial base could never match American productivity. The carriers lost at Midway were never fully replaced. The pilots killed could not be retrained, not to the same standard, not in the time available. Japan's war became a fighting retreat, trading space for time, hoping for a negotiated settlement that would never come. The symbolic object that recurs through this story is the torpedo, but perhaps it should be the factory, The factory that produced the torpedo, the factory that produced the aircraft, the factory that produced the fuel and the bombs and the spare parts. American victory in the Pacific came from factory floors in Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles, from women welding aircraft fuselages and men stamping out engine components, from the unglamorous work of mass production that turned raw materials into military power faster than any opponent could destroy it. When Maury flew over Akagi's deck that morning, he carried more than a torpedo. He carried the weight of American industrial capacity, the promise of eventual victory through sheer productive power, the certainty that losses would be replaced and attacks would continue until the enemy was overwhelmed. The Japanese sailors who looked up at his aircraft in that frozen moment understood this, even if only subconsciously. They saw not just a single bomber, but the harbinger of what was coming. Waves of aircraft, fleets of ships, an enemy who would trade 10 losses for one victory because they could afford to, because their factories were already building the replacements, because industrial capacity had become more powerful than tactical skill or strategic brilliance. In the end, the story of Maury's flight over Akagi is not really about torpedoes or aircraft or tactical decisions. It's about the moment when two different philosophies of warfare collided above the Pacific. Japanese naval doctrine, built on precision and efficiency and the decisive battle, met American industrial warfare, built on abundance and attrition and the willingness to accept losses that would be intolerable to a lesser economy. The fact that no one fired as Maury's aircraft roared overhead, or rather, that many guns fell silent or held fire, symbolizes the deeper truth. Japanese gunners, trained in precision fire and disciplined tactics, found themselves facing an enemy who didn't play by those rules. An enemy who sent land-based bombers on naval torpedo attacks. An enemy who pressed attacks through impossible odds. An enemy whose tactics seemed suicidal until you understood the larger strategy. Trade losses for time, trade time for production, trade production for eventual overwhelming superiority. The moment passed in seconds. Maury's B-26 climbed away from the fleet, trailing damage, fighting for altitude, racing toward Midway and the hope of survival. Behind him, the mobile force continued its preparations, unaware that American dive bombers were already beginning their final approaches. The battle continued toward its terrible conclusion. But in that moment, as a crippled American bomber roared 50 feet above the deck of Japan's flagship carrier, as Japanese sailors looked up at an aircraft that should have been shot down, but somehow kept flying, as Maury looked down at faces frozen in surprise and fear and determination. In that moment, the future of the Pacific War was written. Not in the torpedo that missed, not in the attacks that failed, but in the demonstration of will, of industrial capacity, of the absolute commitment to continue attacking, no matter the odds or the losses. This was the message Maury's flight carried, more powerful than any explosive. America would keep coming. With better aircraft, with more ships, with improved tactics and overwhelming numbers. And eventually, inevitably, industrial capacity would triumph over skill. The sun rose on June 5, 1942, over an ocean changed forever. 4 Japanese carriers had slipped beneath the waves. The mobile force was retreating. American forces, bloodied but victorious, controlled Midway. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. And somewhere on the ocean floor, Maury's torpedo rests in darkness, a monument to all the weapons that missed, all the attacks that failed, all the desperate missions that seemed futile in the moment, but accumulated into victory. It speaks to a larger truth about industrial warfare, about democracy's hidden strength, about the power of abundance over precision. In total war, there are no wasted efforts. There is only the long accumulation of force, the gradual wearing down of the enemy's will and capacity, the eventual triumph of the side that can absorb more losses and still keep fighting. This is not the romantic vision of warfare, not the clean, decisive battle where skill and courage determine the outcome. This is warfare as industrial process, as economic competition, as the grinding mathematics of production rates and casualty replacement. But within that grinding mathematics, individual courage still matters. Maury's decision to press his attack, his crew's discipline under fire, the skill that kept a dying aircraft flying just long enough to reach home. These human elements transform industrial warfare from mere statistics into human drama. The numbers tell us who won. The individual stories tell us what was paid for that victory. The torpedo on the ocean floor, the buried aircraft on Midway, the memories of men who survived and those who didn't. These are the true monuments to the battle. Not the grand histories or strategic analyses, but the physical remnants of individual courage in service of industrial war. They remind us that every great strategic victory rests on countless individual actions, most of which fail, but which collectively create the conditions for eventual triumph. This is the paradox of Midway, the truth that Maury's flight over Akagi illuminates. Industrial warfare strips away individual significance while simultaneously depending absolutely on individual courage. The torpedo missed. The mission failed by conventional metrics. Yet the attack mattered profoundly. It bought time. It disrupted operations. It demonstrated will. It contributed to a victory that changed the course of the war and the shape of the world. And that, in the end, is why no one fired as Maury's B-26 roared overhead. Because in that split second, facing an enemy who should have been dead but kept fighting, Japanese sailors glimpsed the future they were racing toward. A future where American industrial capacity, fueled by the courage of men willing to press impossible attacks, would eventually overwhelm every defense and every resistance until victory was complete. The torpedo rests in darkness. The aircraft lies buried in coral. But the memory of that morning, when courage and industrial power combined to turn the tide of the Pacific War, that memory remains. It reminds us that freedom and democracy draw their strength not from superior virtue or divine favor, but from something more mundane and more powerful: the ability to harness industrial capacity, to convert economic strength into military power, and to find men willing to risk everything in service of eventual victory. June 4th, 1942. The day the Pacific War turned. The day American forces, outgunned and outmaneuvered, but backed by industrial capacity and individual courage, proved that precision could be overwhelmed by persistence, that skill could be defeated by abundance, that the long mathematics of industrial warfare favored those who could afford to lose battles while winning the war. Maury's flight over Akagi's deck lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds contained multitudes. The courage of individual men, the power of industrial democracy, the terrible certainty that this war would be won not by the most skilled or the most brave, but by the side that could absorb the most punishment and still keep fighting. The torpedo missed. The mission failed. Yet victory was won. This is the paradox and the truth of industrial warfare. Written in the sky above a Japanese carrier on a June morning in 1942, when no one fired and everything changed.